All right. Thank you everyone for your patience and just letting a few friends join us. So tonight we have the author, Matt McDonald, with us to discuss his latest book, Towards an Ecosystems Approach to Climate Security. Professor McDonald is Reader in International Relations in the School of Political Science and International Studies, University of Queensland. He is currently working on an Australian Research Council funded project examining comparative national responses to the security implications of climate change. Paul Williams, who will be engaging in discussion with Professor McDonald, is Professor of International Affairs at the George Washington University, where he is Associate Director of Security Policy Studies MA program. Before joining the faculty at GW in 2006, he worked at the University of Birmingham and Warwick in the United Kingdom, where he was a colleague of Professor McDonald. Professor Williams, I now turn the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, and welcome again to Matt. Congratulations on the publication of your book. Cambridge have only managed to put the introduction freely available on the website, so far at least that's as far as I've got, but it's great to have you here in conversation to tell us a little bit more about it. We couldn't be at a more interesting and important time to discuss these issues, so Matt, over to you, and then we'll get into some questions and discussion.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's nice to be interacting with Paul where we're not talking about our co-edited textbook. So this is a nice change and great to have the opportunity to speak with you all about my book. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional Indigenous owners of the land that I'm currently speaking to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you to Paul, thank you to Thomas, thank you to everyone at the Elliott School for inviting me along to talk with you about the book. Let me just start by saying, of course, I've been working on this relationship between environmental change generally, climate change specifically, and security for a while. And we see, I think, increasing recognition that climate change is a security issue, and that we might say we've seen it securitized. It's been discussed on several occasions in the UN Security Council, 7 times most recently, just in September. We see it featuring in national security strategy documents. There's a series of think tank analyses that attempt to sort of point to the role of climate change as a so-called threat multiplier. And of course, lots of discussion of the role of climate change in conflict in different parts of the world or in creating instability, with some even linking climate change to conflict in Darfur and in Syria, suggesting there are pathways there associated with the effects of climate change creating conditions, either in the case of Darfur for population movements with populations coming into contact and conflict with each other, or in the case of Syria, significantly creating economic problems associated with the agricultural sector that fed protests. In both cases, those linkages are contested, but there is this general sense now, and certainly in the UN Security Council, that we need to really seriously talk about the role of climate change in creating conditions of instability. So, of course, there's been lots of attention, and this creates a series of questions, both analytical and crucially normative. So analytical questions are questions like, how exactly does climate change contribute to instability or conflict? Does it warrant being considered a security issue? And if so, what would be appropriate policy tools to address those challenges? On the latter, on these normative questions, the question here is often, is it a good thing to think about an issue like climate change as a security issue? Does it help to mobilise attention to this issue, to speak to audiences who might be unmoved by the plight of other living beings or future generations, but are concerned about instability or population movements? Or is it best avoided because it arguably militarises a problem or takes it into a space where we stop dealing with it at the level of, deliberative democracy and normal policy processes? So these debates, while abstract theoretical debates that keep people like me and Professor Williams off the streets and in employment, are actually central to the ways in which the UN Security Council has debated it so far. We've even had the most recent debates, or the Indian delegate actually invokes securitization and the concerns about it. Ultimately, what I would say is, while there's been this significant focus on whether approaching climate change as a security issue is a good thing, I would say in some ways that's not the right question. What matters really isn't whether climate change is viewed as a security issue, but how security is understood or defined. And in this book and in earlier work, I distinguish between different discourses of climate security, different frameworks with different choices about whose security matters, the referent object, what the threat actually is, how we should respond to it, and who has responsibility for that response. And this is really important, this distinction between different ways of making sense of that relationship, because they encourage different sets of practices to deal with it. So we see, for example, the way a Pentagon report on the security implications of climate change really focused on the ways in which climate change might pose a challenge to US national security as traditionally defined, and use this example, this is back in 2003, use the example of people being displaced by the effects of climate change, potentially looking to cross the border into the United States, kind of the opposite of the day after tomorrow scenario. But the concern in this context was, maybe we should respond by developing our border security controls to better manage the flow of population. And in this sense, you have this perverse policy response to the implications of climate change, where not only not addressing the problem itself, but you're positioning those who are immediate victims of climate change as a threat to national security. So that's a problematic response. We see at the international level, we see the focus through the UN Security Council on the ways in which it can create instability through population movement, creating conditions in which internal violence in particular becomes more possible. But again, the focus here is often on how do we maintain the status quo? How do we preserve the international system as currently constituted? Not necessarily how do we deal with and conceptualize harms to the most vulnerable. So a human security approach that we've seen, we saw a chapter of the IPCC report in 2014 dedicated to the human security implications of climate change. But again, here, there are concerns about whether this takes us far enough in terms of recognition of rights and needs of other living beings and future generations of humans. So in other work, and this is the large part of the setup for the book. The first couple of chapters of the book outline my conception of security as constructed, as political, and as something that has ethical implications in terms of the choices that we make. And then the next chapter really tries to map this engagement with the relationship between climate change and security and differentiate between these different discourses of climate change and security. And you can see there the types of choices that I make. It's a simplistic typology, but it's one that sort of helps then understand how I've come to the point that I'm at, which is ecological security, and essentially trying to defend this particular image of security understood in terms of the resilience of ecosystems themselves. So essentially that previous work attempted to map these different discourses, and it concluded with the realization, to put it really, really crudely, that some security discourses are simply better than others. National security discourses focus on indirect threats and encourage adaptive responses to climate change. International security encourages more of an emphasis on international stability and the preservation of the status quo that for many simply isn't fit for purpose when it comes to understanding how we address climate change. Human security constitutes here an obvious response, but it's still focused on presently living human populations, not on future generations and other living beings who are the most vulnerable to the immediate effects of climate change. They're the least responsible for the problem, of course, but they're also most directly affected and compromised in terms of their life prospects, and least able to influence a response to the security implications of climate change itself. So that context, that mapping exercise, essentially got me to the point of saying, well, some of these discourses are better than others. If I want to make a case that ecological security is an appropriate way of thinking about responding to, if there are limits of these traditional discourses, then let's push further and actually say, what does a progressive approach to the relationship between climate change and security look like in terms of what sets of ethical assumptions and commitments is it based on, and what sets of practices does it encourage? So that's essentially led to the context for the book. So the book asks, what constitutes a defensible approach to climate security that encourages appropriate practices to address the problem itself, and answers, as the title of the book suggests, with ecological security. So having outlined the approach to security in theory in the theory chapter, and then discourses of climate security in the literature review, the book then outlines, the next 3 chapters are dedicated to outlining what is ecological security and why is it necessary, and that's chapter 3. What it means in practice in terms of the means and agents of security in this approach, that's chapter 4. And crucially, chapter 5 is the difficult question, how do we get there? To what extent do we see any policy purchase or indeed resonance for this way of thinking about climate change and security? And this draws on a former colleague of Paul's and mine at the University of Aberystwyth, Andrew Linklater, developed this account of critical theory, where he said the role of critical theory is to do is threefold. It's sociological, it's normative, and it's praxeological. So the sociological is really about understanding where we are and the conditions of possibility in the present. The normative is about saying what constitutes a good and how do we actually think about progress. And the praxeological is a question of how do we actually get from the present to the progressive or the good. So that's the context. Now, what is ecological security? It's defined in terms of a commitment to ecosystem resilience. So this in turn orients towards the rights and needs of the most vulnerable across time, space and species. And this is a need that arises not just in the context of the limitations of existing ways of thinking about the connection between climate change and security, but also in this context of this new geological era of the Anthropocene, this era in which essentially we're unable to, where human behaviour, human action has had demonstrable effects on the Earth system functions itself. And in this context, we're not able to make the type of separation between humanity and nature, between the human and the conditions of our ecological existence, that were really central not just to the way we thought about our role in the world, but really central to modern political thought. So in some ways, the Anthropocene context is something of a game changer when it comes to thinking about the human condition and the role of us as people in the world. So those contexts are important. In terms of why it's necessary, again, not just the limits of other discourses, but also this context of the Anthropocene. The book itself draws on a combination of ecological thought, second generation ecological thought, people like Robin Eckersley. It actually draws on feminist thought in making a case for interrelationships and the intersection between different forms of harm. It's acutely challenging in many ways, given the complexity of prioritising responses and the scale of uncertainty or complexity. So it's interesting when we think about climate change now, we don't tend to get political leaders. Even Donald Trump was stopping short of saying climate change isn't happening or it's not human induced. That has changed over the last few years. But what we do have is still those saying we're not quite sure about exactly when some of these effects will happen, about tipping points, about whether when ecosystems themselves. So we see a lot of different types of ecosystems, and this is one of the complex things about using ecosystems as a referent object. There's millions of them, and some of them are very, very large, like large-scale marine ecosystems. Some are very small. they're all affected in different ways. They might have different tipping points. So a small increase in temperature might be enough to fundamentally compromise some. Others will continue to function with potentially larger forms of environmental effects. So that is one of the challenges here. And in broader terms, addressing climate change, one of the challenges is also this uncertainty about not knowing for sure exactly whether we will see things pictured in the day after tomorrow, like the shutting down of the Atlantic corridor, or the death of the Amazon rainforest, or those types of effects. So that's particularly challenging. The threats in this discourse are direct and immediate threats that undermine the welfare and create harm for other living beings. So that's the sort of what are we talking about when we talk about ecological security? How do we understand the referent object and threats? They are ecosystems, and the focus is on their resilience. So in this context, it's less about the preservation of ecosystems or conservation, in part because we know in the context of climate change that some degree of climate change is already locked in, and that we do see changes. So it's less important to try to preserve what we have, because in many ways that might not be possible. And more important to think, resilience gives us a language to talk about how ecosystems continue to function even in spite of change or perturbation. So that explains, I think, the commitment to resilience. So that's all quite challenging and complex in terms of, what do we think? How exactly does it work to think of ecosystems as a referent object of security? How do we make sense of threats, given they could be multiple if we're talking about the functionality of ecosystems that are very different and that we don't necessarily quite understand? Things don't necessarily get a lot easier when we talk about agents and means of response in this context, but we can prioritize certain forms of response. So clearly, if our focus is on the direct and immediate effects of climate change, it encourages a central role for mitigation, for simply reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There is some potential role for adaptation, both of human societies and ecosystems, to ongoing change, to try to protect existing populations and existing beings. And even, this is a fascinating area that I've been getting into more recently since the book, even there's a case for some form of geoengineering, at least in theory, in terms of the response. But all those particular practices have to be ameliorated through a commitment to dialogue, to humility, and to reflexivity. So I make a case that actually we need to make sure we're talking, especially with communities on the ground, to understand how ecosystems function, but also engage in deliberation to try to build understanding of what it is we're doing when we're responding to some of these effects, to try to build more of a social consensus for these types of response. Humility is about recognition that we don't know for sure exactly how the interventions that we make in response to the climate crisis, how they are going to play out in terms of the types of effects they will have. And this encourages us to be humble in terms of what we're claiming and what we initiate in response. And then reflexivity is related to that, but it's about stepping back and continually interrogating the assumptions that we're making and the implications of our actions in practice. I define agents in terms of all actors who have a capacity to generate avoidable harm, having some degree of agency and responsibility even. But this responsibility is defined primarily in terms of capacity. So it's primarily, we're talking about large-scale private corporations, but states, and especially developed states, as having particular sets of obligations to lead in terms of the response to climate change itself. Individuals clearly have a potential role to play, but again, our individual choices are usually conditioned significantly by state policy, by economic, by dominant modes of economic exchange, and so on. So, and I can follow up on any of these things because I'm going through a chapter in about 2 minutes. So the final substantive chapter is really about how do we get there? How do we get from this recognition, okay, this sounds like a good way to think about the relationship between climate change and security that encourages progressive sets of practices. How do we move from where we are now to that more progressive approach? And here I draw on the work of sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and make a case that we can find that his account of the relationship between structure and agency is such that we can recognise the structural constraints that we find ourselves in, but also crucial avenues for agency in terms of promoting particular sets of responses and not necessarily thinking of the status quo as capturing the limits of political possibility. So here I draw as well on the notion of imminent possibilities. So things that we can recognise that are broadly consistent in some ways with the precepts of ecological security, like a commitment even to precaution and the precautionary principle, which encourages us to think about potential harm rather than existing forms of suffering exclusively. Ideas like common but differentiated responsibility, which is of course central to climate change, that again has been a central sort of component of that discourse around responses to climate change and is broadly consistent with ecological security. The Anthropocene context, Oxford principles associated with how we think about managing or regulating geoengineering. There are lots of things out there, and even forms of ecological protest that we're seeing on the streets, of course, today in response to the climate talks in Glasgow. There are all these different things that in different ways point to the fact that some of these ideas do already have a degree of purchase and support. But we also need, I think, to push further to recognise radical alternatives and not allow the contemporary international system and institutions that we find within it to determine the limits of our response. And I think actually this is going to be one of the big things for the study of international relations and security as a whole. It's going to be recognising actually the imperative of responding to climate change and the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in, and the ways in which that climate crisis itself should encourage us to think in different ways about the institutions that we have, and in particular whether they are fit for purpose. So ultimately, the contemporary challenge of climate change, I think, really does encourage us to rethink a lot about international relations, including the way we think about security if we are linking the two. And I make the case in the book, in the earlier chapters of the book, that we do need to engage security, in part because it's so central to the political legitimacy of key actors of global politics. States and the whole social contract is predicated on the promise of providing security. The United Nations system, Article 1, dictates that the UN is there to provide for the maintenance of international peace and security. These things are not incidental tasks to be undertaken by the key institutions of global politics. They're actually why these institutions exist. And for that reason, the provision of security in the face of what is the most pressing existential threat becomes really important. And it's really important for us to think then seriously about what it means to link climate change and security, what practices that encourages, and how we can actually go about encouraging more progressive, more appropriate, more ethically defensible ways of thinking about and responding to the climate crisis in this context. There are lots of big dilemmas that are associated with this book, and in a way that I've made myself a big target with this set of large-scale claims about the way we should think about our place in the world, what security means, how we think about ecosystems and the ecological context. Those are just a few, and there's possibly many more that Paul and you all will potentially probe me on in just a moment. That's a picture of the cover of the book, I've been told, and I have seen versions of it on Twitter that look broadly similar to that, but I'm looking forward to getting my hands on it at some point soon. But I'll leave my comments there.
Thanks very much, Matt. And yeah, no, that's a shame you haven't managed to get your hands on a physical copy yet, but this is the virtual world we're living in, isn't it? By default, as it were. Look, so I found it really compelling, a number of things that you, arguments that you made in the book. I just want to sort of reiterate a couple that I heard. I thought the discourse mapping that you do is really useful, both for researchers and students, I think, because you're absolutely right. We're talking past each other a lot of the time when we use the same words, but those words are not imbued with the same meaning. And so mapping out the different national, international, human and ecological security discourses, I think, is a really great and useful starting point. And then I thought the the case about the Anthropocene era that we're in now really does, to my mind at least, shatter that artificial divide that you talk about between humanity and nature. We're not in separate sort of spheres, but it's processes that are all about interrelationships, as you put it. And I think that's an important foundational claim that you make. And I like the idea too that your point here about the discourses, it's one thing to map them. And in many ways, that's the easy bit, I suppose, isn't it? The really tricky bit is to start parsing and evaluating them and say that some discourses, they're not all created equal. And what are the criteria that we can then look at to judge which of these is better when each of them stems from a particular political community or a particular group and their commitment to these their security preferences. But I thought you did it very well. And what sort of did it for me on the sort of superiority of the ecological security discourse that you talk about is twofold. Is one, it takes account of all of the relevant beings and processes and actors that go into that, that core problem of the planet's changing temperature. Whereas all of the other discourses are only partial in that sense. They're only taking a sort of anthropocentric, but also then individually narrow a look at different parts of political communities and their role here. And so it's only ecological security that encompasses the whole thing. And then finally, on the ecosystems, again, I was persuaded, right? For me, this is the fundamental building block of life on planet Earth. If we don't have the ecosystems we rely on, the human debates, as it were, could, well, it doesn't matter, right? If we don't have ecosystems that work. And that finally, your argument about the importance to think of those ecosystems, not just in terms of conserving and preserving them, but resilience should be the watchword, I found, again, really persuasive, right? This is going to be future types of change that they're going to have to deal with. So I'd say, congratulations on a book well done. It took a long time coming, but that's, all good things come to those who wait. I had a couple of questions to kick us off. And one is the first one really stems from my own ignorance about precisely ecosystems. And you define them in the book as communities of interacting organisms in a given space. But my question is really, how interrelated are these ecosystems that we've got on planet Earth? And you talked about, obviously, some of the big ones and little ones, and they come in all shapes and sizes. But my first question I'd like to hear from you about is, to what extent are they sort of sovereign or autonomous, or whatever the right term is here, or are they all interconnected to greater or lesser degrees? And if, as I suspect, it's probably more of the latter, right? There are ecosystem interrelationships. Then my question is really, okay, same thing with the discourses now for ecosystems. It's one thing to map them, but are some of them more important than others? And where in your work would you start looking to prioritize? Are there certain ecosystems that we really have to prioritize in terms of their resilience, and some that we can sort of pay slightly less attention to initially? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Wow, thanks for that, Paul. That really good big question around ecosystems. But it's funny that I've presented this a few times, and I've had as pushback about some of the things that you were sort of relatively happy with. I've spent an entire session where we didn't get past my attempt to defend resilience. I've spent sessions where I've been trying to defend the idea of the Anthropocene as a game changer. So there's a lot in this that could be targeted, but the ecosystems one is one that has come up before. And it is, of course, yes, it's the latter in terms of interrelationship. We're not talking about autonomous, self-contained entities. The challenge, and this sounds like, in some ways, what my response to this sounds like a cheat or a get out, but in terms of how I would defend a focus on something that is as amorphous and potentially encourages us to prioritize some ecosystems over others. This is sort of Rita Floyd's point in response to some of the arguments I've made. I would define ecological security less as a discourse that provides us with a set of rules, and more as a sensibility. So when we think about our approach to the world and conditions that we're in. We approach it with the broad lens of how do we think about retaining the resilience of ecosystems, whether small, large, whether incredibly significant for the functionality of Earth systems like the Amazon rainforest, or whether significant for the frogs or whatever that live in it, and a little pond off, in a park in DC, whose name I've forgotten. I was hoping to throw that in casually, but that if we approach this relationship in that way, then it will encourage better sets of practices. So I know that sounds like a cheat to that question, but I would also say, look, answering security through the lens, we think it's a lot easier to sort of say it's about national security, then we know what we're talking about. But of course, we all know that national security is incredibly contested, this contested space about which parts of that community are worth defending and which can be thrown under a bus, what threats we conceive as being important, what our time frame is. And then each individual nation state, each community within nation states understands and approaches those things in different ways. So in some ways, it sounds like a way of getting out of responding directly to the question, but I'd say ecological security works as a sensibility, but also that actually, while it sounds looser and amorphous, we should remind ourselves that these problems aren't wholly resolved if we're just focusing on national security or international security, for example.
Thank you. Yeah, which brings us to the national security discourse. So obviously, yeah, from my vantage point in DC, that's the main game in town, right? It's the dominant one politically and probably intellectually as well. And so just here last month, I'm sure you saw, we had the US National Intelligence Council put out, to my knowledge, right, the first ever national intelligence estimate on climate change and US national security specifically. And I wanted to ask a question based on what you said near the end there about some of your current work on geoengineering, because one of the findings that I thought was important in the NICS study there was that they assessed that there's going to be an increasing chance that some country is going to unilaterally test and deploy some sort of large-scale solar geoengineering product. And they assess that this is going to create, or at least has the potential to create, serious disputes, in part because there's not international governance mechanisms and an agreement on either what these technologies are or how to use them. And so any attempt to sort of do a unilateral geoengineering effort, even with potentially the best of intentions at heart, right, may lead to blowback, as they put it. And so I wondered, does your book speak sort of directly to this? Does your analysis end up having something to say about that type of response to climate change? And given your emphasis you've just put on the resilience of ecosystems, do we really know what we're doing with such geoengineering projects and where they might end up? So do you agree with the concerns that the NIC shares, or do you have a different view of geoengineering?
Great question. I find geoengineering it's such a fascinating area. I've really, it's been one of those things that I've been really happy to get into with a paper that I wrote up subsequent to the book. So in the book, I make a case, I broadly agree with that assessment, actually, about the potential more traditional security implications of the unilateral deployment of geoengineering. And I actually think that it is likely that we will see that type of intervention, especially, because some ecosystems that are seen as being particularly significant to particular countries. So in my own, in the case of Australia, for example, there's talk already of using stratospheric aerosol injection as a means of trying to minimise the warming of the barrier reef, because of course it's essential to large-scale tourism in Australia. It's also ecologically incredibly significant, but it's more vulnerable to even small levels of temperature rise. We see significant coral bleaching. So Australia is already sort of talking about the potential of experimenting in that space. In the book, I basically end up, broadly speaking, endorsing the so-called Oxford principles developed by Steve Rayner and others around how do we regulate, how do we think about how should we think about the regulation of geoengineering, whether it's carbon capture and storage, sequestration, whether it's stratospheric aerosol injection. How do we think about modes of regulation? I think most of those principles are broadly defensible in terms of the way in which we should be incredibly cautious about these implications, because it's we can, for example, say that something like stratospheric aerosol injection will involve cooling, but it also could have flow-on effects for different ecosystems. It could change rainfall patterns. So there's dangers about monsoon functionality if it's used at a significant level. There's also, it doesn't necessarily address problems of ocean acidification. So some effects of climate change, like immediate temperature rises, will be addressed, but not all of them. And so thinking about it and its role in the suite of measures to address ecological security, it necessarily, I think, has to play a role as a short-term strategy while we get mitigation going to the level we need to. There's a fabulous book in the sort of cli-fi sort of space called Ministry of the Future that begins with, it's a very famous book, but it begins with this narrative around, I think it's India unilaterally deploying significant geoengineering mechanisms associated with stratospheric aerosol injection and some of the strategic implications of that. It's worth, if you are interested in this space, I think that's I'd start with that Kim Stanley Robinson book.
I will. You piqued my interest. I mean, I think it would be a fundamental game changer. I mean, if the weather or the atmosphere becomes political or politicized, right? If someone is seen as having responsibility for outcomes like that, I think that's a very interesting and serious set of issues to grapple with. One last question. I want to put you on the spot a little bit, again, from the sort of Washington, DC and national, but now sort of international prism as well. So, you've made, I think, a good case for the ecological security discourse, but in terms of sort of international politics, with your research and on-going work, right, can you give us a sense of, are there any states and governments out there that are actually doing reasonably well on some of these things? Like, are there any sort of best practices, or if not best practices, are there some examples of countries that are actually pushing towards this type of discourse and meaning, and actually in practical terms? And at the other end of the spectrum, do you think there's any real, who are the real laggards here, or who are the real sort of countries that are causing most damage in terms of the agenda that you've outlined?
Well, so the new project that I'm working on looks at different national response of those countries that have explicitly acknowledged the security implications of climate change. How exactly have they gone about defining the threat and responses to it? Because actually you see lots of different ways of locating that response. So in the US context, for example, there's been a real traditional Pentagon type focus where the focus has been on defense and on, hardly surprising given the scale of the military apparatus in the US, but the focus has been on how do we equip the military for a climate change world in terms of the types of missions it'll be undertaking, in terms of how sustainable its equipment will be, how exposed the infrastructure is to changes in that context. Whereas countries like Germany, like Sweden, have focused on how do we use diplomatic leverage to try to escalate this issue at the international level through the Security Council. Other countries like the UK have focused on developing a whole of government type approach. One thing that I think is fascinating is, and while the discourses that I map are a useful foil and context for the Ecological Security book, actually a lot of the concerns that people have about let's not default to a national security setting when we think about climate change, most of those countries that have been most amenable to, say, discussing climate change as an issue within the UN Security Council are countries who are also pushing incredibly hard for significant international mitigation action. So, which is exactly what is consistent with ecological security. And the other fascinating thing is that the countries in the Security Council now who are most opposed to discussing climate change in the Security Council, which is Russia, China and India, are also those countries that have been dragging their feet internationally on the question of how we should respond to mitigation imperatives. So in some ways, any embrace of security so far has been good, regardless of exactly how that's been understood. But I would say when you actually drill deep into the way in which some of those European countries or New Zealand are focused on the security implications of climate change, they really aren't just talking about how do we preserve the nation state and insulate the state from the effects of climate change. They're also focused really significantly on how do we integrate this into the way in which we do our part in response to a complex global problem? How do we think about obligations to others through aid programs that help them in terms of their resilience and capacity building? So those countries are moving in that direction, even while it's often through this language at a superficial level of national security. The contours of those discourses are much closer in many ways to human security, and even in some instances to ecological security, which kind of challenges elements of the book, but it's nonetheless fascinating in terms of, you know, the choices that some of those states are making.
Well, that, I guess, is going to be part of the trade-offs, for want of a better term, in terms of getting to a more practical agenda, right? There's going to be no sort of pure praxeological way of dealing with this. It's going to be a mix and match. So I'll stop and hand it over to other folks if they've got questions for you.
I'm going to take advantage of my position and jump in for a more academic-based question. For prospective students, or I suppose professors, could you recommend, aside from the book you've just been discussing, any journal articles, reports, or other resources that students can really tap into, whether they're just learning about this topic or really seeking to fine-tune their expertise?
Thanks for that, Jocelyn. Well, as we were mentioning in the conversation before we started, you're just up the road in DC from the Centre for Climate and Security, which publishes some really good work, and they're doing some work that speaks to the expertise of Paul in terms of, and my colleague Alex Bellamy here at UQ, in terms of trying to think about whether there's something in this responsibility to prepare. They're talking about responsibility to prepare and prevent when it comes to climate change. So using elements of R2P to talk about the ways in which we should respond to some of the effects of climate change. Because their work is a combination of, they have some academics who do some commentary for them. In fact, that was why I was in touch with them. I've been solicited to write something that connects with this book for them. But they're also quite policy oriented, and they're keen to influence policy settings. So that could be a nice in between. At a pure academic level, I think the best people working in this space, Simon Dolby has been working in this area for a long time, and his work, I think, is exceptional. There's a series of people in Germany and Sweden who have used in part the interest of their own countries to try to propel some sort of substantive engagement. People like Lucille Martins, who's in Switzerland, Delph Roth in Germany, Judith Hart in Germany, Marlin Mobjork. There's a lot of really strong people. And of course, in the US national context, Joshua Busby at Texas has a book that's just about to come out. He's one of those people who does a kind of summary pieces really, really well. So in terms of this is with the state of the literature now, I think he would be a good one to start with. And I think he's actually just been seconded to work for the Biden administration on elements of this approach as well. So lots of good sources out there. Of course, my book is easily the best, but and great value at only over $100 US, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to actually ask a question if you don't mind, Matt. Yeah, well, first off, thanks for speaking with us. Really enjoyed the presentation. I wanted to ask, you talk about several different types of security discourses, and I wonder where maybe energy security lays into this discussion. Specifically, I think of, as we look towards solutions or kind of responses to this, there's been a huge push for this green energy transition or this energy, economy. And so I'm wondering, there's a lot of concern about deep sea mining, or there's a lot of concern about indigenous land rights. So I see a huge intersection between energy security and ecological security. And I wonder, does it impact, ecological security and how we do it, or does it maybe sometimes help because there's a huge emphasis on doing it right this time, like we didn't do with carbon and oil, and trying to think about the social license to operate? But what role does energy security play in its connection with, ecological security?
Oh, it's such an important question. Energy security. It's interesting. Energy security, and I would say food security as well, have been traditionally approached in a particular way. And I think the mindset when we think about both of those, traditionally the focus has been on sovereignty and control. Basically, how do we ensure that we control enough of those things, that we have enough energy, access to energy that we can ideally, that we're responsible for, that we can control, or indeed how do we, food security is often about food sovereignty rather than basically exchange and movement. So I think part of the challenge in this context that ecological security encourages us to think about is less in terms of that framework of control and sovereignty. When it comes to something like energy, we need to think in much broader terms about facilitation of transfer of resources, especially for, and that's going to be one of the big things that will feature in Glasgow over the course of the next week. It's basically, what does this look like in terms of developed states, not only going deep in terms of accessing new forms of renewable energy and helping to supercharge that transition, but also how do we help facilitate those types of transitions in the developing world, and what obligations the first world has in that context. So I think it's absolutely a crucial issue. Energy is in the background of all of this. So whenever we talk about mitigation, we're talking predominantly, given the role of the energy sector, of electricity production in particular, but also transport, we really are talking about energy use and the imperative that the way in which we use that energy changes. So energy security is there. I don't actually use the term that much in the book, but of course this is absolutely central to all of it. Probably an ecological security framework, I think, encourages us to think in different ways about the obligations we have when it comes to the provision of energy. But if you're in India, or if you're in China in particular, it's absolutely central to thinking about what obligations you have to your own citizens. And if you're in places like Australia, sadly, or Russia or Saudi Arabia, it's absolutely central to how you continue to make as much money as possible out of exports of products that we should be transitioning away from. So it's going to be huge over the next week in Glasgow. Watch that space, I think.
Thank you, Matt. And speaking of, Glasgow is just a very perfect setting to have this book talk, and it should be really interesting for our audience members with their newfound knowledge from your discussion here to look at those talks in Glasgow. So thank you very much. One last call to the audience. Please raise your hand, or if you have any questions, or pop them in the chat box. Seeing none flooding in, we will let you go early and reclaim a few minutes of your morning or evening, wherever you are. So thank you very much, Matt, for joining us bright and early for you, and to discuss your wonderful book. And I'm sure we will be seeing it on some syllabi soon.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. We will be sharing the recording of this talk, so please feel free to reach out, or we will host it on the Security Policy Studies Student Board website. Thank you so much, everyone.